The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was primarily defined by an ideological clash in which the Soviet Union wanted to build a world of communist countries and the United States wanted to promote one that was more democratic and capitalist in nature. So one defining difference is that ideological component, and the second is the means through which both sides try to achieve their goals. I would say foreign military interventions and proxy wars, in other words, the military aspect of the relationship, was the defining characteristic of that competition. Another issue between those two countries is the fact that the two sides weren't really engaged with one another, and they were both trying to build separate spheres of influence. So they weren't actually directly competing on a day-to-day basis. They were trying to build up separate areas where they had outcompeted the other. I would argue that currently the competition is mainly in the political and economic spheres. And the military aspect of the competition is increasing over time, though it's not as much of a defining feature as it was between the United States and the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the competition is still mainly regional. The contours of what the region means has expanded over China's rise from East Asia to include now Southeast Asia, Central Asia, as well as South Asia, so it's kind of the whole Indo-Pacific. But I would argue that this competition is not really global, but more regional. Another aspect is that the United States and China has much more engagement with one another, whether it's people-to-people relations or in international institutions. This is a good thing because it allows for more understanding and more dialogue, but it also means because we are trying to compete with each other in the same space, that there's actually more room for friction as well. So I would argue that a new Cold War is not the worst case scenario that we can have. In the U.S. China relationship, there is much higher a possibility of actually a hot war between the two countries than existed between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so if the scenario that we find ourselves in is one in which there's more and more competition between the two sides and perhaps the two countries are moving farther apart, I would argue that that's better than alternatives in which the two sides actually end up fighting a war. That being said, it would obviously be more ideal if engagement and areas of cooperation continued between the two sides as the competitive elements got more and more tense. But in general, I think currently the United States and China define both of our interests in such a way in the region that it's highly unlikely that tensions and increased competition over time can be avoided. So I think there's two reasons. The first is the Chinese military and the U.S. military don't share the same symmetries of power as the United States and Soviet Union did. So we don't have the same conventional deterrence present, and we also don't have the same nuclear deterrence presence because it's unclear whether we have a relationship of mutually assured destruction with the Chinese. In other words, I think quite reasonably, China has pursued a different nuclear doctrine in which they have a quite limited number of nuclear weapons, and they are prepared to use those nuclear weapons only to deter nuclear use. What that means is that the Chinese haven't leveraged those to try to deter conventional conflict. And so that's why I think the United States considers more conventional possibilities. And also we have all these outstanding territorial disputes between China and U.S. allies that could potentially drag the two sides into a conflict. The problem I see is not the policies that the two sides have. Right now, policies are derived from how the two countries are defining their national interests. And in Xi Jinping's China, the national interest is defined in such a way that it precludes a very strong U.S. military presence. For example, with the South China Sea, China's interpretation of international law is such that the United States military can't be present there. For the United States, Washington defines its own national interests as being present in Asia, militarily, in that if the United States can't defend its allies and partners, it loses its leadership role. And given the global nature now of threats and competition, the United States believes it has to be able to operate freely around the world, even to protect the homeland. So given that China defines its national security in such a way that it wants the U.S. military farther away, in the United States, we define our national security such that we need to be closer to China. it is kind of hard to avoid this conflict of interest. And then you see the policy stemming from that. So you'd have to basically see a completely, just a rethinking and a reformulation in both capitals about what they need to be secure and what they need to protect their national interests globally.